Welcome back everyone. Now we're going to be talking about a very important topic, and that is strength and extraction. It's really important because this is something that we're going to be coming back to again and again and again in future videos, and a lot of the variables that we'll be using to manipulate your espresso extractions will be in order to adjust the strength and extraction. So let's talk about what each of those things actually are. 30% of a coffee bean is soluble mass. So this means water can actually extract it into a brew. So let's start with strength. Earlier we compared espresso and filter coffee, and we spoke about the strength of each. I said that the espresso coffee was 8 to 12% coffee, 88 to 92% water, and I said that the filter coffee was 1.5% coffee and about 98.5% water. So what does this actually mean? When you extract coffee, what you're doing is the water is taking soluble compounds from the coffee and extracting them into the brew. The percentage of soluble coffee compounds in the brew is what we refer to as the TDS, or the strength of the coffee. So that covers strength. Now let's take a moment to look at extraction. About 30% of a coffee bean is soluble mass. So this means it's soluble compounds that you can extract into a brew. Now in most cases, you don't want to extract all of that soluble mass because this can lead to over-extraction and some pretty negative flavors. And on the other hand, if you don't draw enough of that soluble mass or those soluble compounds into the coffee, this will generally lead to under-extraction, and you'll be missing compounds that will bring balance and bring desirable flavor notes to the brew. So how much of each of these things do we typically look for? There's no right or wrong answer, and it is a very subjective thing. That being said, the Specialty Coffee Association does have some guidelines around this, and most espresso will sit within these ranges. So for strength, they typically recommend that the strength of an espresso should be 8 to 12%, whereas the extraction should usually be between about 18 to 22%. Once again, these are guidelines. It's based on flavor, your preference. It's very subjective. I've had espressos at 6% strength, and it's been very enjoyable, very pleasurable. But the one thing to consider is the lower the strength, the more watery the brew is going to be and the less texture it will be. The higher you go in strength, the more texture you're going to have, the more viscous the brew will be. But if you go too high, it can reach a point where it's actually undesirable as well. So you've got to find that balance depending on what you like. Now, over time with enough experience, you'll be able to taste strength and extraction in coffee. You won't be able to taste the exact percentage, but you'll be able to recognize when something is of a high strength or something is of a low strength, or when you may want more extraction or less extraction, say. That being said though, there are tools that we can use to actually measure the exact TDS in a coffee, and then we can use that number to then calculate the extraction percentage. So in a moment, I'll walk you through exactly how to do that. Okay, so in a moment, I'm going to walk you through how to use a refractometer in order to measure the TDS of the coffee, and then we'll use that number to determine the extraction percentage. One thing I'll say before we actually do that though is these numbers won't tell you what the coffee is going to taste like. It doesn't tell you what the coffee compounds are actually made up of. So for example, you can have a coffee at a TDS of 10, you can have another coffee at the same TDS, and they could taste completely different because this doesn't tell you what exactly you've extracted into the coffee. So with that being said, I don't use this as a tool to dial in coffees, to develop recipes, but there are some uses that it does have, and I'll go through those in just a bit. The very first thing we want to do is we want to take some distilled water, which I've got here, and we are going to apply a bit of this to the prism. And we're going to zero it. So what this does is it calibrates itself to the water, so that way when we add espresso, we'll get more of a consistent reading. So how this device actually works is light shines through the prism, and then depending on how many total dissolved solids are in the water, that will cause the light to bend. And the amount that the light bends is what we call the refractive index. The tool then uses the refractive index in order to calculate the total TDS and then spit out a number for us to use. So we've got our distilled water here. I'm just going to zero this device. So you can think of it almost like tearing your scales, right? You put the cup down, you tear the scales, and then all we're going to be reading now is not any of the TDS or the total dissolved solids in the water. So a way you can think about zeroing this device is similar to weighing espresso. So when you put the espresso cup on the scale, you tear the scale so that way the reading is purely the amount of espresso in the cup and not the cup itself. Similar thing when it comes to this, we don't want to be reading the total dissolved solids in the water, so we're going to tear the water and that way we'll be reading just the espresso itself. So now I've done that, I'm just going to remove the water from the prism. Be really careful to not scratch the prism as well, because this can affect the readings. I'm just going to soak up that water with a little bit of a napkin here. Now, whenever you're using one of these devices, I recommend that you take an alcohol swab, and we use this to clean the lens in between readings. So I'll leave that there for now. I'm just going to dry it once again before we measure this espresso. So I've got a double espresso here. I know what the recipe is. We're going to use the recipe later on in our calculations to give us the extraction percentage. So we've got this syringe, and what we're going to do is we're going to insert some espresso into the syringe and really mix all those compounds up. I find the easiest way to mix this is to use the syringe rather than a spoon. You tend to get a better result doing it this way. And then we're going to draw some of this into the syringe. From here, we're going to take this filter disc, and this is going to filter out any solids or sediment that may affect the reading. So I'm going to attach that nice and firmly, and then just a couple of small drops on the disc, just enough to cover it. We can remove this and place this over here. Now we're going to wait a moment for it to cool. So depending on the temperature of the liquid that you put on here, that's going to affect the viscosity and ultimately affect the refractive index, which can give you inconsistent readings. So usually I let the espresso cool for a little bit, and then I place the espresso on the prism and let that cool for another 30 seconds or so. Okay, so let's give this a go. Okay, so it's reading 9.95% TDS. That being said, I normally keep hitting the button and keep testing until I get 3 consistent numbers in a row, and that usually tells me that the coffee has sufficiently calibrated to the right temperature. .95. Cool, 9.95. Okay, so this is sort of smack bang in the middle of the SCA standards that I told you before, in that they recommended espresso to be brewed within about 8% strength to 12%. So this is right in the middle. What we're going to do in order to calculate the extraction yield from here is we're going to take the yield of the espresso, divide that by the dose of the espresso, and then we'll times that by the TDS. So this espresso was a 46 gram yield. We'll divide that by the dose, which was 23 grams. So we've got a nice round number to work with. So it is going to be 2 times 9.95. So this coffee is an extraction of 19.9%. Now, this is a basic calculation that we use to determine the extraction yield. That being said, there are more complex extractions that take into account things like the amount of residual water inside the bed of coffee and other factors. However, I find for our purposes, this is going to be close enough. All right, so we've got these numbers. Let's talk about scenarios in which it might be useful to actually measure the extraction yield and the TDS of the coffee that you're working with. So one example that comes to mind is competition. So when we compete, a lot of times when we take our coffee to the competition venue, we might be brewing it to a water that we're not familiar with, and this could change the flavor of the coffee. So one thing I did is, before we came to the venue, I actually tested my coffee. I tested the TDS, the extraction yield, before going to the venue, and then tested it again at the venue. And I found that based on the water that we were using, we were under extracting the coffee. So by using this as a tool, I was able to increase my extraction. It gave me a bit of an idea as to what direction I needed to go in terms of the variables and how I was adjusting them. That's one reason you might use it. Another example I've seen in ways that people will use this as a tool is for roastery cafes when they're selling coffee to their wholesale accounts, right? So I've seen in cases they'll actually give them extraction yields and TDS targets to hit, and that helps get their accounts in a bit of a zone as to where the coffee should be sitting. As I said before, this doesn't tell you what the coffee is made up of. It doesn't tell you what compounds are in the coffee. So it all comes down to flavor, and using the steps that I'm about to give you, in how to dial in your espresso and your milk-based drinks. Okay, so that's it for now when it comes to strength and extraction. We'll be coming back to these topics later on in the course. See you in the next video.